And we're back in the studio like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this windy, not particularly cold, but earlier in the day it was raining, as my mom would say, like the hammers of hell, Thursday here in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today is Eddie Murphy's 64th birthday. He is 1 year shy of becoming a senior citizen. Eddie Murphy, born on April 3rd, 1961, grew up on Long Island in Roosevelt. If you've ever heard of Roosevelt Field, that's Roosevelt. You know, the name wasn't Franklin Roosevelt, or maybe they named the town after Franklin Roosevelt, but Roosevelt Field was not just randomly named Roosevelt Field. But who is buried in Grant's tomb? Grant. You know, sometimes things are Captain Obvious. But Eddie Murphy has been a star since his teens. And there are certain people who, as I like to say, they just have the magic. And Eddie Murphy, from a very young age, whatever the magic is, he had it. And he started as a stand-up comic. He was doing what they used to call, back in the day, blue material. He did a lot of very edgy, out there, I don't want to necessarily say George Carlin-esque, but his material from when he was a kid, he was already challenging audiences. He was not simply doing standard observational humor or storytelling, which was mostly rated PG or PG-13. Where he had parallels with Richard Pryor and George Carlin was he wasn't afraid to rip on sacred cows. He was not afraid to make his audience uncomfortable, talking about topics that they really maybe didn't think that they were going to be getting into when they agreed to a 2-drink minimum and sit in the front row or sit in the back row. But Eddie took risks, and he just was a live wire when it came to natural talent and charisma and stage presence. Stage presence is something that is it's sometimes very hard to explain. And there are times where a certain stand-up comedian appears to have great stage presence, but then other times the same stand-up comic might seem lost at sea. And for example, Jerry Seinfeld, who started as a stand-up comic, I think he's a little bit older than Eddie actually, but Jerry started as a stand-up comic, and you can find clips of him in the early 80s on YouTube looking very comfortable on stage. But then when he made his comeback after the end of Seinfeld, which he famously got into it with Larry King when Larry thought that he got canceled, and I thought Jerry was going to stuff Larry King into a fucking garbage can. He said, "Don't you know who I am? Somebody get Larry my resume." That was one of the great interviews of all time. Larry King always tried to be like he was plugged in. You walked away. They didn't cancel you. And Jerry's like, "Canceled? Canceled?" But when Jerry went back to stand-up comic, he often seemed a little bit lost on stage. You get out of the rhythm. Or in the immortal words of Sylvester Stallone in Cliffhanger, you just lose the feel. But Eddie Murphy, at various points of his career, I don't even know the last time he toured, but when he goes on stage, even for a few minutes, when he got the Mark Twain, I think it was the Mark Twain Award in 2015, and he famously went off on Cosby, and it was unbelievable. But he hadn't really done that, and he just picked up where he left off with his amazing impressions of various people in different accents, different ethnicities. Eddie always had the magic. And his film career, I want to say, started because of his very early success on Saturday Night Live. And I don't actually know that. I didn't read that. I'm making an assumption here, and if I'm wrong, I apologize. But he started on SNL. He probably was a featured player, was what they used to describe certain people as, where they're kind of in the background in a lot of scenes, but they're not technically a cast member. Jay Moore, for example, who's had a pretty good film career and is a stand-up comic. He has a podcast. And I remember he fires Tom Cruise in Jerry Maguire, but Jay Moore was a featured player on SNL circa 1994. But for reference, Adam Sandler was part of the cast, and then later, obviously, Jim Breuer and Will Ferrell was part of the cast. But Eddie Murphy, in his early days of Saturday Night Live, was given more leeway and more of what you would call creative freedom than you would have expected from they all talk about it, a kind of a control freak that was Lorne Michaels. And, Dana Carvey, Mike Myers, they've kind of joked about it. They're on good terms with Lorne Michaels now. But Lorne was he was very fastidious. He was on top of everything. There was very little that ended up on Saturday Night Live that did not pass muster with the big boss. And there is something to be said for that. But Michaels, he saw something in Eddie, everyone did, that he was different. And, I mean, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, that was a nervy bit, like Church Lady in later years. But to have something that's a sort of a joke, a goof on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, like that was pushing the envelope there. That was not just, filler. I hate to say it. There were certain seasons with Saturday Night Live where the show really wasn't clicking, like the Charles Rocket era after the original cast had started to depart. But Eddie was riveting. And my dad, who was a big fan of the show, he would say this, may he rest in peace, my dear old dad, the C, as I like to say, but for those who don't know, the C in SCF & Co., the mug is not accidentally there, it just happened to show up. No, paying tribute to my dear old dad, the biggest movie fan that I ever knew. But he would talk about, you never knew what Eddie was going to do. You never knew what he was going to do, and it made you want to tune in even more because he was liable to say and try anything on the spur of the moment. So he was cast in 48 Hours. He was 19 when he got cast in a big studio, big-time writer-director in Walter Hill. I mean, Walter Hill is very well respected then as now. It's kind of almost a legend, not even almost, a legendary name in the business. And 48 Hours is a movie that I don't actually really like. I don't think it's successful. But Eddie is spectacular. There is not a moment where he looks like a kid playing dress-up, reading lines. And he ad-libs in spots that you could sort of compare the screenplay to what Eddie does. And Nick Nolte was not a guy who was known to fuck around a lot as far as going off script and ad-libbing, but he matched Eddie's energy in the film. My issue is I just don't think the story is that interesting. I've seen it 4 or 5 times. I don't even remember the story. Whereas other Eddie Murphy classic films, I can kind of give you almost beat by beat, but the story isn't that interesting. What is interesting is the chemistry between the mismatched cops of, Eddie plays Reggie Hammond, and is it Jack Cates? I'm not sure if that's his name. I want to say his name is Cates. But either way, the film was a big hit, and it spawned a sequel years later when Eddie's star had kind of begun to fade a little bit. A number of disappointments. The thing is, in Hollywood, and this applies whether it's the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or today, we love a big movie star. We love a new superstar. But you don't have that many opportunities. You hit the scene and you have a couple of big hits, but it's not like you can produce unlimited bombs and stay on the A-list. Now, this is an area where Bruce Willis, for example, bucked the trend that I'm talking about because Bruce had a lot of bombs, a lot of box office disappointments, but he had enough films which overperformed and overachieved where he stayed on the A-list for a couple of decades, and that's very unusual. You're in rarefied air when you're on the A-list for as long as Bruce was, and you think about Clint Eastwood and Tom Cruise. This is very rare. Cruise is a unicorn. He's in his own stratosphere. But to show you that and to explain and understand that stand-up comedy is very much, and more so than movies, product of its time. Because I remember as a kid when Eddie Murphy Delirious, the stand-up special he did where he had that kind of crazy outfit that he wore, it wasn't velvet, but it was some kind of material that you would never expect somebody to wear on stage. That was groundbreaking, pioneering. He got into a lot of really, nerve-wracking sort of stuff where people in attendance are like, man, what are we doing here? But people loved it. And it was replayed on HBO over and over, and so many friends shouldn't really have been allowed to watch it when they were 9 years old, but their parents kept putting it on, and it was a scream. Now, I never watched it. I just saw clips of Eddie Murphy Delirious. But I remember when Dolomite, the film, what is it, Dolomite Is My Name, came out right around early COVID, and Eddie Murphy Delirious was back on Netflix. It didn't work. The humor just, it was, some of it was topical, but there were a lot of other bits he did that just didn't work anymore that were like, forget This Wouldn't Fly Now. It's not funny. There's stuff that was funny in 1982 that is just, it doesn't work anymore. It's dated material. This is why stand-up comics continue to try to change their act and don't just keep repeating the same jokes. And that's something that Seinfeld talked about in the Seinfeld documentary called Comedian, when I mentioned how he made his comeback to stand up and he looked a little bit lost at sea at various points, but he needed to keep creating. He said, if I'm not creating, if I'm just telling the same jokes with the same kinds of setups and punchlines, I'm not doing myself any favors, and I'm not being there for the audience. They want something different and distinctive. And Eddie's film work has always been different and distinctive, whether or not he ad-libs, as he famously does in the original Beverly Hills Cop, or he more or less sticks to the script, as he did in his Oscar-winning turn in 2006's Dreamgirls. And it's so ridiculous to contemplate this. But there are a lot of people in Hollywood who have said, in their opinion, they don't have any hard proof of this, but Eddie was, it looked like he was going to win Best Supporting Actor for his role. I guess he was kind of a James Brown type of singer, because it's basically Berry Gordy and Motown. Jamie Foxx, they give the character a different name, but Eddie was going to win the Best Supporting Actor Oscar, the story goes. But then the movie Norbit came out. And Norbit, although a box office success, so many people hated that movie. It was like a Nutty Professor, but worse, because I happen to think that 2 Nutty Professor movies were hilarious. But Norbit was just bad. It was in poor taste, and it wasn't funny. It was all bad. And the sense is that it probably cost Eddie the Oscar, and that's really unfortunate. We'll never know if it's true. But Eddie had won a Grammy, he won an Emmy. He almost could have been the EGOT, Emmy, Grammy, Obie. Well, no, he wouldn't have done that. And Tony. No, Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony. He wouldn't have won a Tony because that's for, stage work. But Beverly Hills Cop, the script was not that good. And the irony is, here's a little bit of a trivia question. You know who had the Beverly Hills Cop script first? Sylvester Stallone. Read that script, and Paramount was interested in him playing the main character. I don't know if his name was Axel Foley. I'm not sure about that. But Stallone loved the script. But he said, hey, can I take a whack at the script, maybe make it better? Yeah, Sly, knock yourself out. So Stallone, went home for a couple of months, then resurfaced, submitted a screenplay for Beverly Hills Cop. He took out the humor that was in the script that he read. He made it a straightforward action thriller suspense film of a Detroit cop who ends up in Beverly Hills. The studio wanted to do it, but they liked the humor. They wanted an action comedy or something in that ballpark. They didn't just want a blood and guts Rambo type thing where, Rambo goes from Detroit to Beverly Hills, and that's kind of what Stallone came up with. So Sly bowed out, and that's how Eddie got into that movie. But the script that Stallone turned in, that he had taken Beverly Hills Cop and twisted in another direction, he ended up using, Stallone that is, a lot of the same concepts from his version of Beverly Hills Cop. He put that into what became Cobra. So the joke is that Stallone was trying to make Beverly Hills Cobra, and it didn't happen. But I got to be honest with you, I'd love to reboot The Matrix and have Cobra be, it's Axel Foley, and we'll call Stallone Axel Foley. We call him Marion Cobretti, I don't care. But he starts in Detroit, and he goes to Beverly Hills and gets involved with all of those wacky people. Could you imagine Stallone of that era fucking around with Judge Reinhold and the late John Ashton? I mean, it would have been comic gold, but the point is that Sly didn't want to make a comedy. He wanted a blood and guts actioner, which is what Cobra ended up being. But Eddie ad-libbed so much. I have seen the shooting script for Beverly Hills. Most of the big laughs are not in that script. So what Paramount thought was funny, it wasn't really that funny. Eddie was funny. He came up with that herpes simplex 712 or whatever the hell he's talking about. He came up with that. He had about 30 seconds to prepare and he figured it out on the spot. He was amazing in that film. It's another movie I don't really love that movie. I think it's just okay. Buddy films are tough to do right. And the same filmmaker who was Martin Brest ended up doing Midnight Run 4 years later with the late Charles Grodin, also John Ashton, and Bobby D, Mr. De Niro. And I think that's the best buddy comedy ever made, a buddy film ever made. And 48 Hours, Beverly Hills Cop, but Midnight Run is the best one ever. But after the success of Beverly Hills Cop, Eddie did this kind of weird movie, Best Defense, with Dudley Moore. And of course, I'm sorry, I forgot Trading Places, which he did in between 48 Hours and Beverly Hills Cop. Trading Places, another movie where Eddie is sensational the whole way through. And he's on screen with big hitters. Ralph Bellamy, my gosh. And not Hume Cronyn, what am I talking about? The guy he won, Don Amici. That is embarrassing that I called Don Amici Hume Cronyn, but the reason why I did that is they were all in Cocoon together. But Ralph Bellamy and Don Amici as the Duke brothers, and the scenes with Eddie, he doesn't seem out of place. He doesn't look like a kid. Holy shit, Don Amici, well, he was going to win an Oscar in a couple of years, but Don Amici was a star in the 40s. Ralph Bellamy worked with Cary Grant. No, he's not cowed at all. Working with Denholm Elliott as the butler, fantastic actor. Was in the Indiana Jones trilogy. He seems at home wherever he is. He doesn't shy away from Dan Aykroyd or Jamie Lee Curtis. Paul Gleason, talk about an intimidating actor, right? Remember him 5 years later in Die Hard? I mean, he's an absolute riot. We're going to need some more FBI guys. Top 10 great line readings from the 80s. We're going to need some more FBI guys. So Trading Places, it's not really supposed to be Eddie's movie. He steals the film. 48 Hours is supposed to be Nick Nolte's showcase. He steals the film. Through nothing more than sheer force of will and incredible talent and focus. Because natural talent isn't enough. You have to be able to apply it correctly. And yeah, I'm sure he got good direction from terrific filmmakers he worked with there, John Landis. Although he and Landis, they had a kind of up and down relationship, and Eddie at various points, I didn't get along so well with John, great filmmaker, but we had issues. And then they had issues on Coming to America. But I feel like they kind of made peace with it. But Landis is problematic for all kinds of other stuff that has nothing to do with Eddie Murphy or, Michael Jackson's Thriller. But all superstars, with the exception of Tom Cruise, have periods in their career where they go to the well once too often, or maybe they rush a project into production that needed another pass, or maybe they just shouldn't have done it. And Eddie, The Golden Child, is not good. And I don't think Beverly Hills Cop 2, although it was a hit, I don't think it's good. The only best moment in the film is when Hugh Hefner shows up. That's great. But I don't like that. And Harlem Nights, despite him working with his idol and one of his many inspirations, Richard Pryor and Red Fox, it's not a good movie. The pieces are in place for something great, and it just doesn't ignite. And they waste a fantastic turn from Danny Aiello, who's just knocking out one great performance after another in the era. So the kind of first iteration, Eddie Murphy, lurched to a halt. But then he reinvented himself. Because another 48 Hours was a success. It's just not good. But he reinvented himself. He made 2 movies in 1992 with similar concepts. Distinguished Gentleman was later in the year, but Boomerang. And Boomerang, he seems to be poking fun at himself. He seems to be poking fun at the fact that he had a kind of parade of different women that he was seeing at various points, and there was some real stupid stuff when he did Eddie Murphy Raw, which was also very successful, but Eddie to this day will say, we shot the concert footage too soon. I got better as the tour went on. And that's another thing. If you're not a stand-up comic, you would never imagine that, well, maybe they should have shot the film later in the tour. But Eddie Murphy Raw in 1987 the director was Robert Townsend, who I recently discussed on the channel for his incredible low-budget independent film, which was a stupendous success and made Townsend's career, Hollywood Shuffle, where huge chunks of the film are kind of lampooning Eddie Murphy, but Eddie loved that film and wanted to work with Robert Townsend. So stars started to fade, and Boomerang was a movie where he plays a successful marketing executive, but he's a player, and as the film says, a player who's about to get played. And it's not a typical protagonist type of role for Eddie. And The Distinguished Gentleman, I think, is a terrific film. It has a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of an angle. Eddie's performance is right on the numbers. It didn't do that well, and Boomerang was not as big of a hit as it should have been in the summer of '92. I mean, there were some big movies like Batman Returns, Lethal Weapon 3, A League of Their Own, but Boomerang should have done better, and The Distinguished Gentleman kind of got swallowed up by other comedies at the end of the year, such as Home Alone 2. And, Beverly Hills Cop 3 was not good. I saw that in theaters. It was not good. It was a huge disappointment. And he stayed busy. He did Vampire in Brooklyn, which with Angela Bassett. I think that movie's terrific. I think that's underrated by history, but it kind of bombed at the box office, and it was on Nutty Professor in the summer of '96 to kind of resurrect his career. So in a matter of like less than 15 years, he had an entire arc of global box office superstar number one to also ran. And it was just a matter of he didn't pick the best projects. And nobody, with the possible exception of Tom Cruise, nobody gets it right all the time. Because you look at even Clint in the 70s when he was box office star number one, he had certain projects that should have been better. The Gauntlet was not as big a hit as it could have been. It's an interesting film. They're talking about remaking it. The Eiger Sanction didn't do as well as it should have, given the fact that it was an impossibly difficult shoot. That was the most difficult shoot of Eastwood's entire career. He's actually up 5,000 miles on the Eiger. 5,000 miles. He's 5,000 feet in the air on the Eiger. That's really him hanging from a fucking mountain. He could have died because a stuntman died during a take where he was pretending to be Clint's character of, and I love this name, Jonathan Hemlock. But Eddie Murphy is more than just the sum of stand-up comic actor. He is a generational talent. And even if he had movies that didn't work and haven't worked, like he did the film, what was it, 1,000 Words, not good. I didn't really think The Haunted Mansion was particularly good. I didn't like his iteration of Dr. Dolittle. A lot of these movies, they didn't take advantage of what he could do. And if you have somebody like him, you got to use him. And this is something, and one of my certainly top 3 Eddie Murphy movies is Bowfinger, where it was Steve Martin's project, and Martin, as he was wont to do, worked on the script for years. Like Steve Martin worked on what became LA Story for 7 years before, going before the cameras, and he didn't direct that, but he wrote it. It was Mick Jackson who directed that. But Bowfinger, it's like it took another legendary comic in Steve Martin to get max value out of Eddie Murphy and take full advantage of his enormous varying skill sets. I mean, you're not supposed to be able to do everything Eddie can do. To be able to hit the marks in a dramatic way, because Steve Martin showed that he could do that, and be funny in a straightforward setup punchline way, but also be creative and free-forming and ad-libbing and making magic. And Bowfinger, Eddie gets to do it all. Again, lampooning himself. We like, as fans, most of us do, when stars can poke fun at themselves. And it's one reason why I've always believed that Arnold Schwarzenegger became box office star number one, because look what this guy, he's got 20-inch arms, at least, but he's poking fun at himself. He's poking fun at his accent. And in Bowfinger, Eddie Murphy plays 2 characters. Spoiler alert, they're brothers. We don't know they're brothers at first. He plays Kit Ramsey, the biggest box office star in the world, and he plays Jif Ramsey, his nerdy brother who doesn't know which end is up half the time. I think he's supposed to be on the autism spectrum. Takes one to know one. But Kit Ramsey's an asshole. He is a crass, he's a lousy guy. And I feel like Eddie was almost exercising the demons of his younger days, and he seems to be having a lot of fun in that film. And he and Steve worked so well together. I wish there had been a sequel to Bowfinger, but it's another thing that didn't do as well as it probably should have. But that's the way it goes. And then he did Holy Man with Jeff Goldblum. That didn't really work. That wasn't successful. He worked so much. He did Showtime with De Niro. They were hoping to kind of, well, we got Beverly Hills Cop and Midnight Run. Let's see if we make it. Not good. So there were all of these films, Adventures of Pluto Nash, that on paper looked good. They just didn't work. And that's the way it goes. I mean, Coming to America as a movie, the first one, I really like, but there are whole chunks of that film where really nothing happens. It's kind of dull. And Arsenio Hall, to me, steals that film. I think he almost acts Eddie off the screen in certain spots. He's hilarious. And the sequel was just okay. Coming to America. I watched it I guess it was on Amazon Prime. It's okay. It's not as good as the first one. I see what they were going for. It was all right. But Coming to America is notable for one of the first screen performances of Samuel L. Jackson, and he gets to deliver the iconic line, "Who the fuck is this asshole? Excuse my French." I just remember watching the movie and out of nowhere, "Who the fuck is this asshole? Sir, you'll force me to thrash you." Just the way Eddie says, "You'll force me to thrash you," is worth the price of admission right there. I also didn't see the film on Netflix. I had kind of gotten rid of my Netflix subscription when the Eddie Murphy, Jonah Hill, You People, when it aired. And a lot of people really liked it, and they liked that, the way that Eddie's character was handled. Because Eddie looks incredible for his age. We know this. We saw him back in Tower Heist with Matthew Broderick, among others, in 2012. And he just looks a lot younger than he is. But in You People, I think he's playing somebody who's supposed to be about, in his early 60s at the time. And it's a very straightforward performance, from what I can gather, from what I read. But a lot of people they just didn't like the movie. They thought there were missed opportunities. And some people complained that Eddie, it's like he was in a straitjacket. They didn't take enough advantage of his capabilities. On the other hand, I thought Dolomite Is My Name was great. And hey, I'm a cineast, right? I'm a film geek, a lifelong film geek, and I confess, I can't believe I'm going to admit this. I had not heard of Rudy Ray Moore before seeing the movie with Eddie Murphy. And I thought it was great. I would have given it at least 3.5 stars out of 4, 8.5 out of 10. It was a pleasant surprise. Loved Wesley Snipes in the film. I thought he was a riot. Everything about that movie just worked. I was dazzled by it. And I know Eddie recently was on the SNL 50, rolled out his Tracy Morgan impression. That's kind of a mutual admiration society that he and Tracy Morgan have going. But at this point, he is more or less an elder statesman of comedy. He's 64. He's been in the business for more than 4 decades. And I hope that there are a couple of more real challenging movie roles, and maybe, just maybe, he could get another Oscar nomination. Because there are certain people where they hit a particular role and you feel like there's no chance they're ever going to get another nomination. Like, I hate to say it, but Bill Murray in Lost in Translation, that was his shot. Because Bill Murray he's not Sean Penn, who is, right? I hope that Eddie is able to find the kind of role where there will at least be some Oscar buzz surrounding him. I'm really sorry he didn't win for Dreamgirls. I know the film got a ton of acclaim. I thought it was a great movie, and I loved his performance. James Early, right? His nickname was Thunder. Good name. But I could talk about Eddie for hours. This is the kind of thing, almost wish I had a round table of a bunch of fellow Eddie Murphy fans who started watching him when we were kids. I should not have been allowed to watch Trading Places when it aired on HBO in '84. I was only 10. Jamie Lee Curtis might be the answer to a personal trivia question. I think she might be the first woman I ever saw topless when she was topless for about 10 seconds in the movie Trading Places. So Jamie Lee, nicely done. Perfect. As what was it, Rodney Dangerfield in Back to School? I didn't see anything. I swear I didn't see anything. You're perfect. But a happy 64th birthday to a living legend, and a living legend who I believe has a lot more legendary performances still to come in Eddie Murphy, 64 years old today. This has been episode 482 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Thursday evening here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then,